All right, so another video. We are going to be talking about value today. So we're going to be transitioning from linear and planar thinking to value. And so when I'm talking about value, I'm talking about the lightness or darkness of something, oftentimes referred to as shading, which is essentially applying value to your paper to create form. The term that you'll hear frequently used that I'll refer to is called chiaroscuro, which is basically an Italian word. It's spelled Chiaroscuro, and chiaro is light and scuro is dark. So it's the study of light or dark, or the study of how, or the observation of how light falls on an object. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And what's nice about this process is that it's very, not scientific, but reliable and consistent. So the way that light falls on things and the elements or characteristics that each type of light or element of value that an object has is consistent in how it visually represents itself or presents itself. So we're going to be looking at those today. And up until now, we have been mostly focused on linear, right? So using line to show space and depth and gesture, and mostly on the contour. And we are going to now basically be moving away from that. So we want to start thinking of line as, sorry, a little bit too late. We have to start thinking of line as something that we're going to be using as we go to finish a drawing. So we want to avoid line moving forward. Line has a tendency to flatten a drawing. So in this class we're working on building the illusion of three-dimensional form on a flat 2D surface. And so to do that, we're going to be using value to create that illusion. And line will definitely flatten any of the work that you create with your value, basically bringing emphasis to the flatness or the surface of the paper. In general, we do not see line. Line doesn't really exist in nature around us. It's more of a man-made element that is more decorative more than anything. So we'll use line when we start getting into detail work. When we are working with value, I'll show you how to use line to kind of accent things or crispen up areas. So for the most part, we're going to be not working with our pencils moving forward. We'll be working with just our willow charcoal and our erasers, and then pencils at the end for subtle adjustments in value and enhancing detail areas as we progress forward. So going back to the notion of line, so line is used when you're just doing linear drawing to separate an object from an object or an object from the background. But in reality, what actually is happening, so we could use a line here, 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 all the way around the perimeter of this to create this cube to show it. However, what's really happening, what is separating this plane from this plane and this plane from this plane is actually just a value shift. If you look around the room that you're in, you can see that where we would put a line if we were doing a linear drawing is typically, if you look at the corner of your room or any object in your room, for the most part, what's showing definition of the object and separation from the space and the object and another object is just value changes. So that's what we're going to start focusing on, is value changes, subtle to extreme, and when to use them. With that being said, I do want to point out I posted a handout on value for you that you want to have either put up on your computer screen while you're watching this video, or print it out, or on your phone while you're watching, however you want to do it. Having this handout in front of you will be super helpful. I will be referencing it as we move forward. I've included 2 sphere diagrams and 2 value scales that will be helpful for you to look at. So let's see, let's talk about the first, that top sphere. That's a good one. So it has 7 different values listed. The sphere below that has 9 different ones that are kind of supposed to be lining up with your value scale. But typically, and how I will refer to it, we only really need to know about 5. There's 5 main ones, and the other ones are just kind of these in-between verbiage that people sometimes use. The 5 main ones that we're going to be focusing on are going to be your highlight. Let me put a sphere up here for you. It might be hard to see this laser pointer, but it's showing up pretty good. So the 5 main values that we're going to be focused on, and I've put a star next to them on that top sphere as it lists the verbiage going down, the vocab words. So the first one we're going to be focused on is your highlight. So this is, every object will have these 5 values in it. So you'll have your highlight, which will be your lightest light on the light side of the object. That's that bright light right there. And I'll talk more about that when I do the demo of the sphere drawing next up. And then after that we have the midtone. So the midtone is basically the entire rest of the light side of the object. So the midtone will have a lot of variety. So keep an eye on that this is not just white. One thing that we want to do a lot when we're working with value is to squint. So I don't mean just kind of casual squinting, like you gotta kind of look silly when you're drawing and you want to squint. And so try it right now, squint and look at that sphere. Do you see how it kind of simplifies things for you? It's a lot easier to determine the lightness or the darkness of something. When you do squint, it simplifies things, it eliminates a lot of the detail. So make sure you're squinting. You don't want to squint at your drawing. You want to open your eyes wide when looking at the drawing, but squint when you are looking at your still life as a way of simplifying. It also helps you see the subtle differences, that it is lighter here than here, darker down here than here, and it looks to be a little bit darker here than down here. So by squinting, you're able to see those things a little bit more easily, and it kind of helps organize things as you move forward. So make sure you squint a lot. So we have, going back to the values, our 5 values, we have our highlight, our midtone, then we have our form shadow, and our cast shadow. So the form shadow is the shadow that lives on the form, on the object. And we have our cast shadow, and then we have a reflective light. So the reflective light is going to live on the shadow side. It's light that's bouncing from the environment back up into the object on the shadowed side. And those are going to be our 5 basic elements. Every object will have those 5 basic values with transitions in between. I'm going to go through in a little bit later in this lecture some of the characteristics that each of those 5 values have that are fairly consistent and to look out for. We'll talk about that here coming up. So then we're going to look down at the bottom left corner of your handout. You'll see a value scale, 1 through 9, so 1 being your white, 9 being your black. That's typically what's referred to as a value scale, and then it's a gradation building from white to black, or the numbers in between. Typically, most people don't refer to that's a 4 and it should be a 6. It's more of, you need to push that a step darker, or 2 steps darker, or just make it darker. Will be how I would refer to it when I'm giving feedback on your drawings online, unfortunately, as opposed to in the class, but that's a good way for us to streamline communication. But this is a helpful tool to kind of see the wide range that you can get. So in general, we will be let's look at local value here. So local value is a term that you'll hear frequently, and it's something that I'll bring up. A local value essentially just refers to the value of an object on its own. So every object will have those 5 values, 5 types of light hitting it, but it will be dependent upon its local value. So its local value is what it is in flat light, right? So each one of these vases has a different local value. Each one has the 5 value system, right? Highlight, midtone, form shadow, cast shadow, reflective light, highlight, midtone, form shadow, cast shadow, reflective light, and so on. But they're all, to a different degree, dictated by its local value. So if we are going to look at each one of these, we can see, so on that value scale that I put kind of theoretical bracketing around each one. So if we were to look at, the shadow of this is going to be lighter, obviously, than the shadow of that, and this one will be lighter than this as well, but darker than that. So each one will have its own 5 system, but based on its local value and in relation to its proximity to the light source, which we'll talk about later when we cover hierarchy of focal points. But that's something to keep in mind. So in general, we'll be doing what's known as like a full value drawing. So your entire drawing will have the 1 through 9 spectrum from light to dark, but not every object should have 1 through 9 value in it, right? You've probably seen those drawings where they look, the proportions look really good, they look like the objects, but the drawing doesn't look like the objects are sharing the same space, and everything kind of looks like shiny pop can surface. That's because the artist was not paying attention to the local value, or not focused on it, or not intending to sometimes, but in general, if it's someone who had not been taught that, they are giving too wide of a value range, too many values to one object or to all of the objects, having all of them have a 1 through 9, as opposed to paying attention to the local value and the proximity to the light source. So you want to keep that in mind as you do your drawings, is ask yourself what's the local value, and you want to think about value relativity. So relativity is a big thing, obviously in life, but also in art. Everything's constantly relative. Color, and definitely value. So if you look at the bottom of the bottom right of your handout, you'll see a different value scale. There's a gray bar running down the center, and then there's lights and dark bars on both sides of that gray bar, going from light to dark, from left to right. And you can see that that bar down the center is changing from dark to light, going left to right. But the reality is that gray bar down the center is actually the same value. If you cover up all the surrounding values with your 2 thumbs, you'll see that that strip down the center is all one flat gray, but it appears to change and get lighter as it goes to the right because of the values that surround it. The bars that are above it and below it are getting darker as it goes to the right, so it makes that bar of gray down the center look lighter as it moves to the right. So we're going to use that value relativity to our advantage when doing drawing very frequently. The best way to do that is to constantly compare object to object. Which one's lighter, which one's darker? What's the light side of this one compared to the light side of this one? How does that reflective light compare to just the mid-tone of this one? How does this reflective light compare to that reflective light? And so on. So that's going to be something that we do frequently, is talk about relativity and constant compare and contrast of values to one another. That's how you keep that value relativity intact and have your objects feel like they're sharing the same space and feel like the, I guess, even textural surface is created in that manner, which we'll talk about more coming up. But we want to keep that in mind. Hierarchy of focal points, local value, and from there, let's take a look at the basic 5 values of interest here. I'm going to adjust the light a little bit. Hopefully it's not too blown out for you and not too dark. All right. So in general, we'll start with just basic highlight right here. And the highlight, when you're doing your drawing, typically in this scenario, oftentimes that highlight will be, like if I were to, when I draw a demo on this sphere, when I draw that sphere, that highlight that's there is really helpful to determine your lightest light. And because we're working by covering a white paper with dark pigment, that white in this drawing is the white of the paper. So I know that everything around that needs to get darker in order for that to stand out as a white highlight, right? So highlights are helpful to establish what's the actual local value of the object on the light side in particular, to kind of get the ball rolling. So it is helpful to sometimes leave that. You do want to be careful if you have two objects with two reflective lights or two highlights. You do want to compare them because they are not going to be exactly the same brightness. You know, if something's further behind and getting hit with less light. Yeah, I don't know if that's the best example, but you know, that'll be the white of the paper on this one. We want this to be lighter. So do you see when you squint, this remains brighter? That still feels pretty bright, but that's also because it's got a lot of, this is quite a bit darker. If we squint and look, do you see how much, although these are both white, this is like a yellow milky white, this is a more stark white, that when we squint, do you see how much brighter this white is compared to this one? Which is helpful because that will allow this, that might be the white of the paper still, and this would be the white of the paper, but having both of them be white like that, and we might knock that back a little bit with a little bit of charcoal so it's not super bright white, and focus more on pushing this darker back in space to make that highlight pop out. So highlights are helpful, again, hopefully this is showing up on the camera okay, to determine the mid-tone value and the overall. That's a little bit better, a little more. It still feels pretty bright. But in general, I hope that kind of illustrates the highlight aspect. Okay. Midtones. So midtones are, again, on the light side, all of the light outside of that highlight is what was referred to as the midtone. The midtone is where you're going to spend a significant portion of your time. In general, we'll keep, in the beginning of a drawing, you'll keep that shadowed side nice and flat, nice and simplified, and just accurate in its overall value, and put in the reflective light after. And then spend the majority of your time on this light side in the midtone. There's a lot of variety, a lot of texture, a lot of form to build in here. In general, when the eye looks at an object, it will kind of quickly take in the basic shadow shape, but not stare into it. It'll focus our eye tends to focus most of its attention on the light side of an object. So as artists, it's best to also spend time building your form in here and keep the shadow simple. I'll talk about what's important over here in the shadowed side to get in a moment. But in general, that light side is where a lot of the work will be done. Another key aspect of, this is true in general for some of the other elements too, but especially on the light side, is you want to make sure you never bring that highlight right up to the edge of your surface, right up to the edge of your form, nor do you want to bring, like you see how it's quite a bit lighter on this edge over here, as opposed to like the whites that are here. You want to be careful to not take those brighter whites and drag them straight over to that edge and stop. We always want to get a little bit darker right around the edge of the form. Even with our shadow, do you see how it gets a little gathering of darkness right on that edge there? A little bit of extra dark right there. It's harder to see over here. That tells the eye that the form is going away from us, that it's wrapping back in space. So that helps create the illusion that it's a three-dimensional form on your drawing. And if you do it straight up to the edge, it will make it feel flat and kind of cut out. So watch out for that. So when you're working your midtones, make sure you're always kind of getting just a teeny bit darker. If you can't see it very well in the object, sometimes that happens. It's very subtle. You do want to make sure that you are subtly putting it in the drawing. It's an important element to put in. All right, and moving on, we're going to talk about the form shadow again. So the form shadow is the shadow that lives on the form itself. So one of the main characteristics of a form shadow is that it's going to have a relatively softer edge compared to that of the cast shadow, right? So do you see how the edge here of that cast shadow, I'm going to kind of shift it back this way. Do you see how the edge of that cast shadow, especially when you squint, you see how that edge is harder and sharper than here? This is more diffused and softer. The transition of the values are closer, and these are further apart. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. It's a good characteristic that makes a drawing very strong, paying attention to those edges. So look for that when you're doing your drawing. And I'll throw up a bottle here and show you why that makes a little bit more sense after we talk a little bit more about the form shadow. So the other aspect of a form shadow that's super helpful is what's known as the core shadow or the terminator. The core shadow is referring to the darkest core of the form shadow, and the terminator is essentially referring to where the termination of light from the light side ends and the dark side begins. So do you see on this sphere right here, there's this extra dark, right? And although that stretch of dark is getting lighter in itself as it goes this way, what's around it is also getting lighter as well, so it'll always be still darker relatively than what's around it. And that's going to be the terminator or the core shadow. That's what helps pull that sphere out towards us, and it's basically playing with the notion that we'll use a lot in this class is that high contrast, so the lightest light and the darkest dark, will pull forward, and minimal contrast will recede in space, right? So it's kind of nice that you get this darker dark right here, right next to some of the lighter lights. Then with a light reflective light next to it, it helps bow that out towards us. And if we were to look like right here, so we'll talk about that relativity here in a second, but that's basically what it's playing with. So every object will have that terminator. So look for it. If you ever have a drawing that you feel like is, I'm going to lighten that up a little bit so you can see the terminator on that bottle. But you can see it pretty well. See how it gets just darker right there, right along that edge. If you have a drawing that's looking pretty good but the form's not popping, double check that you have pushed that terminator, and that will help a ton to bring that form out. And the reason that exists there, right, is that that's where the direct light stops, and then that's also where no reflective light is bouncing up into. So that's why it's more broken here, and then more intense up here is that this is catching little to no reflective light in this area here of that sphere. So that's why there is no light there, and it is strongest in its darkness. Moving on, we're going to talk about reflective light. So your reflective light is the light that's bouncing from the environment back up into your object. And in general, the basic main rule that you want to remember with your reflective light is that you never want it to be lighter than anything on the light side of your object. So I know when we stare into that shadow, especially on this camera here, that reflective light feels really intense, especially right here. But when we squint, do you see how it kind of gets sucked into that shadow and it does not feel at all as bright as what's on the light side? So you want to make sure you keep an eye on it. That's a pretty common mistake that can really kill your form, is to stare too deeply into that shadow and space and make that reflective light too bright. The reason that feels so bright here is because it's the closest of the reflective light, the closest part of the ball to the surface that's reflecting it, so right here, less so up here, but also because it has these really dark cast shadow right next to it, and then the terminator right on the other side of it that's making it feel brighter. So relatively speaking, that starts to feel as bright maybe as this is if you stare deeply into it, but when you squint, it simplifies it. So another way that we can avoid having this get too light is by and I'll demo this, but you're gonna put your form shadow in, you're gonna work your light side, so you're gonna put that form shadow in, and you're gonna basically kind of give, you can push your terminator, and you can give an overall basic flat value to your shadow, focus mostly on the shape and its overall basic value relationship between your cast shadow and your light side, and then after that, work your light side for a while and really establish its overall value in the form as it turns, getting darker, a little bit darker, a little lighter, until you get that more established. Push this nice and dark. Then you can come in and lightly pull this out with your eraser, and we'll talk about that. You want to apply the light to your reflective light. So you want to build the form and then drag the light out from it. So it's a good way of avoiding that getting too light, is to worry about it after you've done a lot of the legwork on the other parts of the drawing. It'll help you land that value in the right spot. The other aspect of the reflective light, just like on the midtone side and in the shadows, is that you want to make sure that there's a little bit of darkness right after the reflective light. So do you see when you squint, it goes, we have dark terminator, then we have dark, a little less dark form shadow, then we start getting reflective light, and then right at the edge before it goes into this cast shadow zone, you get a little bit of extra darkness right on the edge of that form. So make sure you don't bring your reflective light right to the edge of the form. That will flatten things as well. And those are the basic principles of the reflective light. One good thing to think about are planes. What's a downward facing plane? So these are all kind of downward. The minute it stops going downward, it stops catching light. But all downward facing planes are catching light. All the more upward facing planes are catching less light. So when you're thinking about reflective light, think about the planes, which ones are facing up, which ones are facing down, and which ones are more likely to catch reflective light based on up and down and the surfaces around it that are bouncing light off and onto the form that you're looking at. Is a great way of doing that. So then we move on to the cast shadow. So cast shadows are going to be very similar to some of the principles of the form shadow, in that, so all shadows, so if we look at this, it's good to collectively think of this as one shadow shape, both the cast shadow, form shadow, and cast shadow. And so all shadows will basically start as form shadow and as cast shadow. They will all start soft and become hard and then transition to soft. Okay, so in general, cast shadows will always have a harder edge, relatively speaking, than the form shadow. And cast shadows will also start harder and end softer. So although this is relatively softer, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, see if I can't get this to show up a little bit better for you. So although cast shadows are relatively harder than the form shadow, and they do soften as they move away from the form. That's one, because their distance is getting further away from the object that's casting the shadow. But two, it's also because typically as it moves away from the light source, the environment or object that the cast shadow is falling onto is also getting darker. So if you squint, you see how this fabric is lighter here and getting darker as it goes this way. So these values are getting closer together, and over here they're further apart. So increasing the contrast will make this feel sharper, as will having a sharper edge when you draw it, are two ways that you can do it. The value relativity thing is super helpful in that case as well. So if we just look real quick, now that we're talking about the cast shadow, I started to point it out and then stopped, but if you look at just the cast shadow, when we're talking about high contrast pulls forward, minimal contrast recedes in space, can you see how in general this is slanting backwards, right? So this part of the shadow is the closest to us. This part of the shadow is the second closest to us. This part of the shadow is the third closest to us, back here, that edge, and then this is the furthest away shadow edge, right? So if you look at just those edges, do you see how higher contrast here is pulling this hard edge way in front of this is also a hard edge back here, but a hard edge with less contrast between the tablecloth and that edge. So both hard edges, because they're both close to the form. This one's harder because it's in front, and it also feels more in front because the contrast. Back here, less contrast, right, between back there and here, so that feels softer and further away. This one feels relatively softer than this one, right? So the cast shadow starts hard and soft, but this one feels harder than this one, and it also feels harder than this one, right? High contrast, sharper edge, still sharp edge, but less contrast, and the least amount of contrast and least edge, softest edge back there. So right in that, create a ton of space just by paying attention to value relativity. And sorry about that, had to adjust the setup here so we can see as best we can the form shadows, edges, and the cast shadows, edges of each of these objects. So all of these three balls all at the same time. And now this isn't perfect because the light can't be equally distributed on all three spheres and be able to see them all at the same time, all their shadows all at the same time. But this I think does a pretty good job. So we just want to remember when we're dealing with edges and relativity, having our, so on this, on each one of these, but on this one here, it's form shadow, although hard edged relative to this one, and this one is still softer than its cast shadow edge. But what's cool about paying attention to this is that they're also going to be relative to other objects, and by paying attention to those edges and their difference in the quality of edges of the shadows related to the other objects, qualities of their shadows, edges, gives an indication to the viewer and allows you to portray the textural surface of things. So like if we look at this one, this cue ball, because of its kind of hard glassy surface, has the strongest or hardest form shadow edge and has the hardest and strongest cast shadow edge that remains hardest longest, right, compared to this one getting softer faster. And this object here is its form shadow is not as hard as this object, but it is harder than this one. This one has kind of a porous-y surface, and so its transition from the dark to the light is not as drastic as the cue ball and the plaster one back here. So you do get a little bit of a darker transition, but if we just look at just that core shadow, because it's kind of a shiny surface as well as textured and pocked, kind of porous as well, you get a pretty strong cast shadows, or a form shadow edge. So this form shadow edge is stronger than this one here, but then it's more diffused value-wise by what's right next to it is a little bit darker, say, than this one or this one. But its cast shadows edge is softer than this one and this one, right? So although it has a stronger form shadow edge than this one and not as strong as this one, its cast shadow is less sharp, and it remains sharp for a lesser period of time, so it kind of fades out faster right around here, whereas opposed to these that are both non-porous at all and both kind of solid shell-like surfaces, their hard edge remains longer before it dissipates into a softer edge, just based on its surface. The back sphere has I'd say a little bit of this probably softest form shadow, because of it is a little bit of a matte surface, although it's hard like this one and not porous. It's not shiny, it's got a matte surface, and so it is, although more uniformed than this one, it is going to have a softer form shadow, even if I slightly tip the light directly towards it. So it's more on the back too. You can see how it does have like a pretty hard edge, but still not as strong as this one. Its transition is quicker from the light side to the dark side, right, compared to this one. That's a fairly dark mid-tone right next to that dark. But you can see how hard it gets pretty quick there. So in general, that's quite a bit harder of an edge. If you squint, you can see how this one pulls forward quite a bit more. Like I said, though, it's a little difficult with the lighting setup, but and then again, this has a harder edge here than this one here. So by just paying attention to those relativities amongst one another, not just to itself. You can get a lot of information into the viewer. And again, this is something that you're kind of thinking about when you're first doing a drawing, laying the groundwork for. I'll demo this a little bit more. All right, sorry, it took me a second there to get another object set up and change the lighting a little bit, but I just wanted to illustrate just another aspect of paying attention to the edges. Even in something like this where we just have one shadow edge going all the way down, that shadow edge has a lot of variety in it based on what is a form shadow and what's a cast shadow. So we start off at the top here, and do you see that little V shape of light? If you look at the top edge of that shadow, of where the shadow and the light meet, compared to the bottom edge of that V where the shadow and the light meet, talking about this one right there, that top edge is significantly harder than the bottom edge of the V, because that top edge is the rim of the bottle being casting a shadow onto this bottom part of the rim. And so that edge there is harder, and then this edge here is form shadow, rolling down and under. And then again, right below that we have cast shadow. So we have hard edge, soft edge, and then below that, this form is casting a shadow onto this form here, so that it gets hard, and it goes soft, 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 and then right here it gets hard again. So this is all form shadow, then it gets cast shadow. That's the neck of the bottle being cast onto the shoulder of the bottle right there. That little junction gets a teeny bit harder, then it rolls into a nice soft form shadow in here, and then you see that little dark line there? Do you see how that's a harder edge than here and here? That's because that, although is minimal value compared to that dark cast shadow, this is a cast shadow. This is the shoulder casting onto the body of it. That little ridge there is a cast shadow, then into form shadow, and then a hard cast shadow that then dissipates into a softer cast shadow. So just in that right there, you get a lot of variety. And again, that's kind of a detailed thing, but when you're thinking about it, when you're making your marks initially, that can help guide things along the way. Again, I'll demo this coming up. But it also creates variety when the viewer looks, so our eyes will be drawn towards sharper edges and less so towards softer edge. So what that does is when the eye takes in this bottle, it will slow down at a sharper edge and kind of speed up, move quickly through a softer edge, and then slow down again at a sharp edge, faster through the soft, sharper on the hard. So it creates a rhythm when someone looks at your drawing, even if it's just of a bottle. There's interesting things in there. Everything's not at the same pace, visual pace. So paying attention to that kind of subtle detail makes a big difference in the drawing and your ability to create realism, show what the surface and the texture's like, show what the proximity to the light source is, and create that illusion of form. So hopefully this is helpful. I wish I was with you all to take this a little further. Usually I don't lecture quite as long on this, but I'm not going to be there to help you with your own drawings in our current scenario. But what's great about it, the benefit is that you have the ability to, I usually go a little faster and you don't get to hear me say this again. I just walk around and work one-on-one with you and repeat some of this when needed. But this way you can play this again if need be. And so when you're working on any of your drawings, every once in a while I throw this on, even though it's about a half an hour long, and just look at your drawing while you listen and see if where you can push things a little bit more, or things that you might have missed as far as these kind of rules of light are concerned. So I hope this was helpful. Hope you all are healthy and doing well, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.